NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
So thank you all so much for being here today and for your interest in this field. The things we're going to talk about today are things that you already know. I can promise you that by the time that we are done with this presentation, you are going to say, these are things I already know, but haven't ever really considered. So let's jump right in and talk about what we want to talk about. And the first thing I want to ask you is the foundational question for every attorney, every person in the criminal justice system. How many guilty people should go free before one innocent person is locked up? And if you listen to Blackstone from the 19th century, he would say 1,000. If you watch Law and Order, they would say 1,000,000. But the reason is exactly the same, because the rights we have are precious. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are what make us. So when there is a liberty interest at stake, whether I am going to go free or go to prison or be involved in the criminal justice system in some way, we had better make absolutely sure that I am guilty, because the rights at stake are precious. Think about what you do when you have someone in the criminal justice system who needs something to play an effective role in his or her defense. Someone who speaks Spanish, someone who is deaf and uses sign language, someone who's a wheelchair user. What does the system do? Well, we've already heard that the Americans with Disabilities Act requires the system and requires private attorneys to take steps to ensure that the person can be part of the process. Why? Because again, rights are precious. If I am a Spanish speaker and the questions are being posed to me in English, I can't be part of the process. If I am a sign language user and someone is speaking verbal English to me, I can't be part of the process. And my liberty interest is at stake, and we must protect that. That comes directly from our most basic rights and protections, from the 14th Amendment, well, hell, from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident from 1776 and Jefferson, to 1864 and Lincoln and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We have said that in our system, criminal and civil, we must make sure that if a person's rights are at stake, their life, liberty, or property, we make absolutely sure that person can play a full and equal role in their defense. And the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 that we've heard so much about just extends those rights to people with disabilities. I mean, it's a little disturbing to think that it took till 1990 for Congress to recognize that people with disabilities are in fact and should be treated as people. So the basic tenets of the ADA, that people with disabilities have the right to fully participate in all aspects of society, that people with disabilities should not be denied the benefits of a public system or entity, or that public entities and accommodations must make sure that people with disabilities can play full and equal roles, are just the same things that we have been saying since the Declaration of Independence. So think for a second, divorcing any question of disability, think for a second about your rights, things you never really have to think about. People without disabilities don't think about their rights until they're at risk. So think about the rights that are important to you, that make you who you are, that shape you, that make you say, I'm proud to be an American or a Virginian, that I'm proud to be a prosecutor or a defense attorney. Those rights like freedom of speech, like a jury trial, like freedoms of election. Think about what all those rights have in common. Think about what the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness has in common. All of our rights have choice in common. Freedom of speech is the right to choose what to say. Freedom of trial by jury is the right to choose who will judge us. Elections are the right to choose who will govern us. Choice, therefore, is what makes our rights possible. They make our rights effective rather than hypothetical. I mean, that's why we have the due process clause, because without due process of law, without equal access to law, without full and equal access for people with disabilities, those rights don't mean anything. Your right to trial by jury means nothing if you don't understand, if it's not communicated to you that you have a right to choose that. Think about how many choices are involved in the criminal justice system, beginning with the right to remain silent, invoke Miranda, the right to plead that you are incapable of standing trial or not guilty by reason of insanity, what defense to prepare, how to prepare it, whether to testify, whether to accept a plea, whether to take part in prison program services, and whether to accept specific conditions of parole. These all require a person to understand, make, and communicate a choice. Consider just for 1 second the choice to accept a plea deal. Supreme Court says that has to be knowing and voluntary to be valid. Well, if a person has disabilities, or a person doesn't have disabilities but is a Spanish speaker, or anything else that might impact his or her ability to understand and make that choice, whether to make a knowing waiver, a voluntary plea, the catch-all term of an informed choice, how do we make sure that happens? The same questions are all about the civil system or the probationary system. When a person is choosing whether to accept parole, when a person is choosing whether to accept the conditions of probation, how are we making sure that that person, consistent with due process, consistent with the moral and legal rights we have that are endemic in our system, is given the opportunity to do that? I'll just give you one example, because I've seen plenty of cases where a condition of release is that a person accept a guardian or a person be placed in guardianship. Well, guardianship, if you're unaware of the system, is where a judge gives someone else the right to make decisions for you. That right to make choices that make all of our rights possible is given to a third party, a guardian. And what we know, and I've been involved in the guardianship system throughout this country, what we know is that the guardianship system in Virginia and everywhere else is supposed to work this way. The judge only takes away the rights that the person truly cannot recognize. The judge is only supposed to assign the rights to the guardian that the person truly is incapable of exercising. Why? For the same reason that rights in the criminal justice system are precious. Rights in our civil system are precious. The right to choose who we spend time with, where we go, what we do, whether we work, what type of medical care we get. Those rights are just as precious. And yet, what we know from study after study is that the vast majority of guardianships, over 90% actually, take away all rights from the person, whether or not the person can exercise them. They take away every single right that the person has. We call those plenary or full guardianships. So what we know is that in the guardianship system, guardians have substantial and often complete authority over the lives of vulnerable people. That goes to each and every most basic and intimate right we have. Who we see, where we go, what types of supports and services we receive, what types of programs that we take part in. I am involved in a case right now, or I'm consulting on it, where a person under guardianship, the order says the guardian has full and complete control over the person and body of the person under guardianship. In other words, the guardian decides everything about this person's life and has said this person may not speak with anyone unless the guardian is aware of it. So what that comes down to is that right to make choices in the criminal and civil system really is the same thing. As found by Congressman Claude Pepper on the House Committee of Aging, the typical ward, person under guardianship, has the same or fewer rights than the typical convicted felon. So whether you are a representative of the criminal or the civil system, and I submit to you that they intersect in this area, we must make sure, for the sake of the rights that we hold dear, that each and every person has full and equal access to make choices, what the clinicians call self-determination. Self-determination, just a fancy phrase. It means making choices. People who are self-determined are the causal agents, the actors in their life. They do things instead of having things done to them. They make choices instead of having choices made for them. And that distinction is hugely important, not just because of some ephemeral right, not just because we believe that rights are important, and we do, not just because we ascribe value to our rights, and we do, but because scientifically speaking, it leads to a better life. For people with disabilities, we have 40 years of studies that say people with disabilities who make more choices, who are given the opportunity to make more choices, who are more self-determined, have better lives. They are more likely to be independent, employed, manage their money and do so well, more likely to be integral and productive parts of their community, and better able to recognize and resist abuse. In other words, they are the exact citizens that we want law-abiding citizens to be. If the key to a full and equal and included life is self-determination, then I submit that ought to be the goal of the criminal justice system, to make sure that the innocent are not convicted, but also that people in the system have the opportunity to receive value, to do things from the system, to avoid recidivism if they are coming out of the system, or to be diverted from the system if they have the potential to avoid it. And here's just one example of that. This study up on your screen, the National Core Indicator Study, was done in every state, including Virginia. And what it did was it looked at the quality of life of people with disabilities, particularly people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. What it looked at was whether or not people had a better quality of life depending upon certain variables. One of the variables they looked at, just one, was whether or not a person had a guardian. And what they found in Virginia and in every other state, and by the way, this was an apples to apples study, as I call it, because it looked at people of similar abilities and limitations. So apples to apples, people of similar abilities and limitations, those that did not have guardians, those that had freedom of choice, those that were able and empowered to make informed and knowing choices, we're more likely to work, we're more likely to live independently, we're more likely to have connections in the community, more likely to have friends other than staff or family, more likely to go on dates and socialize and be parts of their community, more likely to have their rights respected and respect the rights of others than people with guardians. That study was done twice, and the results were the same both times. So what we know is that people who make more choices, who are empowered to make more choices, have the kind of lives that we want to live and that we should want our fellow citizens to live. And oh yeah, we also know from studies that people with disabilities who have more self-determination, who make more choices, are less likely to be abused. That was a study done in New York by a professor named Ishita Kempka. I quote it all the time, because parents to me and judges have said to me, well, won't a person be safer if they're in a guardianship? Won't a person be safer if someone else is making these decisions because they might make a bad decision? And I never knock someone for that. I never knock a parent, never knock a judge for wanting to protect, never knock a prosecutor or a defense attorney for looking to protect someone. That should be our first goal. But here's what the science says. Professor Kempka did a classic study. She took people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, women specifically with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And if you don't know this, you should. Women with IDD are exponentially more likely to be abused, neglected, exploited than any other segment of the population, more likely to be physically, emotionally, and sexually abused. So what Dr. Kempka did was she worked with a cohort of women with IDD. And again, apples to apples, they had similar abilities and limitations, and she divided them up. The control group, she said, go live your life. The experimental group, she gave access to a curriculum designed to enhance self-determination, to discuss with them the power, the usage, the value of making choices, to help them learn how to make more decisions. Once that curriculum was done, she brought them back together and gave all of them a test, a recognized test, on the ability to recognize potentially abusive situations and avoid them. Guess what she found? Those with more self-determination, who made more choices, who were more aware of their choices, were better able to recognize and avoid abuse. They were safer. I've told judges this across the country. I've had cases on this across the country where I have said, if you want to protect this person, if you want to keep this person safe, if you want to keep the community safe, don't take away rights, build choices. And again, is that not what we want for a criminal justice system? To be more equitable, to be more fair, to build abilities and minimize limitations. So what we need, where we can go from here, and I hope we can all agree on this, what we want for our system is a system that better empowers people to understand their choices in the system, that makes sure that a plea is knowing, that makes sure that a defense is knowing, that an acceptance of terms is knowing and voluntary and informed. We also want to make sure that people not currently in the system have a way to avoid being part of the system, or people coming out of the system are less likely to return to the system. Something that can enhance life outcomes, reduce recidivism, and minimize victimization. And to do that, what the science says is maximize self-determination, empower choice, and that's a way forward. I realize I'm on slide 18 when I'm finally getting to the point, but the point is a way to do that, a way to maximize self-determination and choice is through supported decision-making. There's a quote up on your screen. If you want to know what SDM is, there's a definition up on your screen. I know this by heart. I've recited it. I wrote it. If you Google supported decision-making, eventually you'll come upon this. So please feel free to screenshot this, to memorize it, to write it down. I would prefer you ignore it. This is an incredibly intellectually insecure definition. And again, I wrote it, people with disabilities working with friends, family members, and professionals to help them understand the situations and choices they face so they may make their own decisions. If you want to go with that one, knock yourself out. But if you really want to know what supported decision-making is, I recommend you treat it the same way I did the last time I testified, when I got some guts. When the judge asked me, what's supported decision-making? And I said, you just did it. Because I want you to think again. Just like you thought about your favorite rights, I want you to think about how you make decisions. What do you do when you don't know what to do? What do you do when you're faced with something you don't know anything about, but you have to make a decision on? When the doctor is speaking jargon at you, do you do what I do and say, would you please explain that in plain language? When you're dealt with a difficult legal issue or a new problem or your taxes or something you don't understand, you go to someone who knows. I have a buddy who knows about cars. Every time I get a high mechanics bill, I call Jeff. Every time one of my kids is having trouble in school, days that end in Y, I call my sister, who is an assistant superintendent of school, because she knows those things. What do you do when you have a personal issue or a relationship issue that you're too close to make a real impartial judgment? You go to a friend, you ask for advice. That's what supported decision-making is. Supported decision-making is getting the information that you need in a way that you can understand it from someone you trust so that you can make your own decision. And we all do it. In fact, I've grown to hate the phrase supported decision-making because it sounds like a program for people with disabilities, when in actuality, it's the way we all make decisions. Every single day, you've probably used supported decision-making in the last 24 hours if you've asked anyone for advice. In fact, think about all the cliches in our lexicon about supported decision-making. Don't make a snap judgment. Don't go off half-cocked. Get a second opinion. My dad used to say, measure twice, cut once. It's all the same thing. Get help. And professionally, we're told to get help. We are told to consult with our peers and our coworkers when we have a difficult problem, to discuss things with someone we trust. That's what supported decision-making is. One example, consider capacity. Capacity motions happen all the time with people with disabilities. And I have always recommended that defense attorneys be super careful with capacity motions. I was involved in several cases where people were found incapable of standing trial for misdemeanors for which they would not have done a day in prison and wound up being in a forensic ward for years. I had to go litigate 5 or 6 cases to get people out who wouldn't have served time. That was before Virginia changed its law on misdemeanors. But just consider capacity for a second, because we think of capacity as a black and white issue, and it's not. Capacity is not something you have or you don't. Capacity is very often depending upon what help you have and how you're feeling that day. Some people, and I will tell you right now, I have capacity right now to do things that some of you don't. And some of you have capacity to do things right now that I don't, because you have skills, you have strengths that I lack. It doesn't mean that I can't do those things, because I can ask you for advice. Some people can't do things at particular times or days unless they have help. Some people can never do things. I can never work on math problems unless I've got help. I'm terrible at math. Some people can't make decisions at all unless they've got someone to talk to. So capacity can, one, fluctuate depending upon how you're feeling. If you have a disability, whether your disability is flaring up. I always make the joke, you want to know if I have capacity? Ask me how much sleep I've got and how many Diet Dr. Peppers I've had. The answer to both is usually never enough. But you want the best example on capacity? No one in this meeting, unless you have a medical license, has the capacity to take care of your health, because you can't diagnose yourself, you can't prescribe yourself medication. So what do? You go to a doctor who can. You talk to the doctor, you give the doctor information. The doctor diagnoses you and says, this is what I think you should do. I think you should take this medication. I want to prescribe this for you. And you say, okay, that's supported decision-making. You didn't have capacity to make that diagnosis or write that prescription. So you went to someone who did. You worked with that person gave you information. You made a decision that you would not have had capacity to make before because you had help. So when we think about capacity in the criminal justice system, before we jump to saying a person can't do things, we ought to be asking, what have we done to empower that person to do things? What have we asked? What have we done? I heard the people in the first presentation today from the Arlington police talk about going around and asking people, what do you need? That's supported decision-making, especially if you're recommending things. The person might not have known those things were available. So that's what supported decision-making can do. It can do for people with disabilities the exact same thing it can do for you. The exact things that SDM do for you every single day to help you focus on your issues, weigh your options, make sure that the decision you're making is actually one that you've thought through and informed, and can help you interpret the consequences of your decisions and communicate those decisions to other parties. That's what supported decision-making can do. It can empower people who might otherwise not be able to play a full and equal and active role in their defense, or empower people who might not be able to make an informed choice of whether to accept a plea, or whether to invoke their Miranda rights, or whether to testify, or whether to accept conditions of parole, to make a knowing choice, to make sure that you, if you are a defense attorney, are not making the decision for your client. So you don't have to go to sleep at night, as I have done, wondering if I pushed someone to do something he or she didn't want to do. You made sure that person had the support he or she needed. And the good news is there's no one way to do it. Something else you already know. Like I promised you, everything I've talked to you today, you already know. You already know, and you already use supported decision-making. You already know, and you already value the powers of choice and self-determination. You're already aware of how important it is to have full and equal access. And you already know there is no one way to use supported decision-making. Why? Because you do it differently than everyone else. The methods that you use, the people in your life that you go to, the areas of your life where you need support are unique to you, and the types of support you use are as well. That's my way of saying, don't assume that every person with disabilities makes decisions the same way, or that every single person can use the same method of support. Some people just need informal support. Something explained to them, someone to listen to them, someone to bounce ideas off of. Some people have what I call go-to people. I do. I go to certain people in certain areas. And people with disabilities might write that into an individualized service plan, or a supported decision-making agreement, or a power of attorney. Some people use, and I know the ARC of Northern Virginia is big on this, circles of support, where I talk to multiple people. I get their input on things so that I can understand and then make my decision. All of these things are supported decision making because all of them involve me coming to you and getting support from you in some way, shape, or form that ensures that I can understand and make and communicate the decisions I have to make. And here's something that's important. We know from research that people with disabilities who use supported decision making are more self-determined than those who do not. In other words, if we empower people to make choices, then we are going to empower them to reap the benefits that have been documented for 40 years of self-determination. The very things that we want our citizens to be: more independent, more likely to be employed, more likely to be integral and productive parts of our communities. All of that is tied directly to self-determination. And in fact, in a study Lucy Beadnell and I did just last year, just published, we worked with 10 young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities of varying abilities, empowered them to use supported decision-making in whatever way that they thought was appropriate to them, and followed them for about a year and a half, collected data, asked them questions, asked questions of people in their lives, looked at the things they had been doing, met with them regularly. And here's what we found, unsurprisingly, I think, based on the science, that people with intellectual and developmental disability, those 10 people specifically, who used supported decision-making to make their own decisions, and all of them had said before this study, they did not feel they made decisions in their life. So we were giving them the power to make their decisions, sometimes for the first times in their lives. We found that they were more independent, more self-confident, were better at making decisions and made better decisions. And even in the midst of a pandemic, had a better quality of life, did more things in their community. So if that's what we know, if that's the things that we can do, shouldn't we be empowering choice? And lawyers, you should already be doing it. Rule 1.14 of the Virginia Ethics Rules is all about supported decision-making. It's entitled Client with a Disability, but it's all about SDM, because what it says is when a client's capacity to make decisions is diminished or in doubt, your obligation is to maintain a normal client-lawyer relationship with that person to the maximum extent possible. And the comment really nails it. That normal relationship is based on the assumption that the client, when properly advised and assisted, is capable of making decisions, and that clients with diminished capacities often have the ability to do so. So we ought to be, as a default, empowering people. We ought to be using supported decision to make sure that those rights that are precious to us, that are built and baked into our system, are available to people with disabilities on an equal basis as everyone else. And that can be done in so many ways. Providing access to a supporter, having someone else come to help that person understand, having the person's choice, obviously with the person's agreement, to help him, her understand you understand him or her, having plain language material. Have you ever really listened to the Miranda rights or really listened to a judge do the knowing and voluntary plea language? If you really listen to it, it's really hard to follow. So maybe we ought to make sure that it's in a form that people can understand so that they're making a true and knowing and voluntary decision. Or something as simple as what Lucy said, offering a little extra time to think, offering a little assistance, or what the gentleman from Arlington said, just asking what they might need to make sure that the decisions being made are in fact knowing and voluntary. And if we do that, amazing things can happen. These are all people who had zero freedom. Zero. They were in full and complete guardianship. Takora here was living in a car and had been charged with vagrancy. Why? She was in a guardianship and her guardian was absent. She couldn't sign a lease. Ryan was working with his parents, who were his guardians because they were forced to be, but didn't have any rights. His parents wanted them to have rights, but the District of Columbia said, no, you're in a full guardianship. That poor young man was the sergeant at arms of a self-advocacy organization dedicated to self-determination, had no legal rights. Jenny Hatch was put in a guardianship where she was not allowed to go where she wanted to go, see what she wanted to see. And if you wanted to see her, you had to fill out a permission slip. where the guardian could say yes or no, whether you could even visit with her. Today, all of these people have their rights back. All of them are using supported decision-making, and all of them are doing quite fine. Thank you very much. That's what I want to leave you with. The rights that we have, the rights that are precious, the rights that got us into this system, that made us say that I want to be involved in the justice system, are the same ones that we must empower people with disabilities to have, so that they may have the same equal access to justice as every single one of us. We're here because we believe in that. Our values are looking for ways to empower people to do that. And it's been my honor to talk to you, and I can't wait to work with you going forward. Thank you so much.